Hey folks, Zach Osterman, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. A little portal check-in for the morning of April 18th. Trying to read the calendar there, forgive me. I swear I've had my coffee this morning. Didn't do one of these yesterday, kind of let the podcast, which Mike and I pretty much dedicated exclusively to the transfer portal with a couple of interludes for Little 500 chat and me letting my dog in from the backyard. So kind of let that stand on its own as kind of our portal discussion, I guess, for the day. Not a ton to add today. This weekend will be an interesting one. I think the first thing to talk about is Connor Essegian held an IU visit yesterday. I think it may have wrapped up this morning or may be wrapping up this morning. Kind of conflicting information getting around about, whether Indiana really kind of moved to the front, whether Essegian, I believe he's supposed to take a visit to Nebraska possibly this weekend. I'm not positive about that. But whether he might, keep future visits. I think he's also been to South Carolina and, if I'm not mistaken, Maryland. Essegian, for those who may not remember him, was a bit of a revelation, averaged over 11 points per game for Wisconsin as a freshman 2 seasons ago. He's from Central Noble High School up near Fort Wayne. Shot close to 36% from three. His percentage was higher than that for most of that freshman season. Then it kind of dipped near the end. I think he probably hit a bit of a freshman wall. Last year he had a back injury that slowed him down early in the season. He really struggled kind of to find minutes for Wisconsin. I think at times he struggled on defense, and I think that there was a suggestion the injury kind of followed him through the season a little bit. His shooting percentages went down, his minutes went down, and he went into the portal after the season was over. So, if you're Indiana, you're looking at him and certainly believing that you can get that player, Connor Essegian as a freshman, you can get that player back if he's healthy and he can, whether he's starting or possibly coming off the bench, he's a player that, can be a real impact shooter for you in particular. And I think that if Indiana can't get him, I think they still need that probably with somebody who is going to be a little bit comfortable coming off the bench if necessary, essentially. And somebody who maybe isn't going to be put off by the idea of at times, playing more of a reserve role. Because Indiana has obviously already a couple of pretty well-established guards in Trey Galloway and Miles Rice now incoming. And to transition to this weekend, Indiana's got another really interesting guard, Kanaan Carlyle, visiting from Stanford. He's a freshman, or he's finishing his freshman season of college. He'll be a sophomore next year, so he has 3 years of eligibility remaining. Carlyle has been on the visit list for a long time for Indiana, about as long as anybody in terms of this portal cycle and when they started to build out their visits and plan through all this. He'll be in town for Little 5 weekend. He averaged 11.5 points, 2.7 rebounds, and 2.7 assists. I got his stats up here. 2.7 rebounds, 2.7 assists per game last season. He was 32 of 100 from three, so 32% obviously, and he made more than 77% of his free throws. He was also 7th in the Pac-12 in league play and fouls drawn per 40 minutes. His assist rate went up in league play. In Pac-12 play alone, his assist rate was 20.9%. His turnover rate was 22%, which is obviously too high, but his assist rate actually went up in Pac-12 play, and if I'm not mistaken, his turnover rate went down ever so slightly, less than a percentage point, but still it went down. And this is for a player that saw a lot of the ball last season for Stanford. He was one of the highest usage players in the Pac-12 in league games, which means that Stanford was putting the ball in his hands a ton and having him initiate the offense a ton. Would Indiana do that as much? Maybe not. I think you'd probably, I've been trying to think of sort of comparisons. One that kind of comes to mind a little bit, and this isn't a perfect comparison, but when you've already got a Miles Rice, when you've already got a Trey Galloway, I think what you'd look at from a player like Kanaan Carlyle is almost kind of where Indiana would sometimes use Robert Johnson alongside Yogi Ferrell. The idea being Yogi Ferrell's your point guard, but if you need someone, then there is a secondary ball handler that can, maybe handle some minutes, can certainly initiate the offense a little bit, can get you going, be a good passer in transition and things like that. I think Indiana probably would let Carlyle work off the ball a little bit more, just looking at his statistical profile at Stanford, looking at Stanford's overall kind of profile as a team, looking at some of his film, and obviously, again, remembering that Indiana's got, you know, Miles Rice coming in, Trey Galloway already here, Gabe Cup's already here. You might have a player like Carlisle where sometimes you'll probably run some stuff for him with the ball in his hands, but you'll also let him be off the ball a little bit more, which is where you might see some of the shooting percentages, particularly his three-point shooting percentage, tick up. Obviously, that would be something that would be welcome for Indiana. 32% is a low number, but for a freshman, there's room to grow if the mechanics are good and the form is good and kind of the will is there. So Carlisle was an Atlanta native, or is an Atlanta native. He went to Milton High School, which is a program that has turned out quite a few talented players. I believe Bruce Thornton from Ohio State, and also, if I'm not mistaken, Shannon Scott. If people remember that name, it's a few years old now. Both played at Ohio State. Both played at Milton. Carlisle also spent time with Overtime Elite, the program down in Atlanta that kind of pulls in some hyper talented players. So the point is, you can see kind of the Atlanta connections again. Yasir Roseman, kind of tapping into some of the relationships he has. You can see certainly the way that Carlisle would fit Indiana if he were to commit. At this point, I'm not aware of any other visits that he's planning, but that doesn't mean he's not planning them. That doesn't mean more can't be added, but he'll be in town this weekend. And, based on everything I've seen, I've heard, I wouldn't be, surprised if Indiana's in a pretty good position to land him if the visit goes well. So that'll be a big one to watch. I think the other question really is, Indiana's kind of had a number of bigs on the schedule for a little while. Elijah Malone, the small college player of the year from Grace College. Amari Williams, who was, I think, 3-time conference defensive player of the year at Drexel, which is in the Colonial, if I'm not mistaken. How does Umar Ballow's, commitment affect those visits? We'll see. I think there's a world where, if you're looking at some of these players, whether it's like a player like Malone or Ben Humrichis from, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. Forgive me if I'm not, from Evansville, players that are a little bit more stretch bigs, guys that can step away from the basket and still find their offense, whether it's, jumpers, handling the ball a little bit, certainly shooting the three. Both of those players I mentioned statistically for the level they were at, previous year, last couple of years, have been good 3-point shooters, particularly for bigs. And so they're kind of more stretch forward type players, at least in theory. And I could see a world where maybe a guy like that is still more interested in Indiana, even if it's coming off the bench, because there's a more clearly defined role. Whereas if you look at someone like Williams or, Pharrell Payne, maybe they would look at Ballo and say, that's very similar to what I do to the position that I play. And, I'm not sure I just want to go somewhere where ultimately all my minutes are going to have to grow kind of in the shadow of somebody else's minutes, if that makes sense. But we'll see, because the portal plus NIL, you never know. Some guys are more comfortable coming in and accepting a bench role, particularly early on, maybe feeling like they can compete to move up, or that, it might be more valuable to be on the bench for a good team, based on their motivations and their priorities than it would be to, be starting for a bad one or a mediocre one. There's always just kind of an assumption that everybody wants to go to the NBA and everybody wants a big NIL paycheck. Some guys might look at Indiana and say, I think that's a path to, playing in the NCAA tournament, something I've never done before. And look at all the guys they've already taken. They're clearly building something. I want to go be part of that. You just don't know. And it will be interesting to kind of see which visitors kind of continue to make it through Bloomington at spots that feel like they have already sort of started to fill up, like the 5, but Indiana clearly needing some post depth. Or let's say you could get Kanaan Carlyle or Connor Essegian or both, I guess, that sort of backcourt rotation. And suddenly you sort of feel like, well, you can be a little bit more targeted and a little bit more picky. But the flip side is, you'll have maybe more players that say, hey, thanks, but no thanks. I don't see a lot of minutes, or I don't see a role, or I don't see an opportunity. there with you based on the guys you've already seen come through the door. And that's where I think, Indiana's probably like, I would say like one more commitment away from really kind of transitioning maybe more into that sort of position, if you will, in terms of, maybe starting to be more targeted, a little bit more focused, and a little bit more details oriented about, the guys that they pursue, knowing that those players are ultimately going to be, kind of put in more confined roles, at least early on. And you never know what happens with injuries. You never know what happens. A guy like Ballo, for example, only has 1 year of eligibility left. So if you can go find somebody who's comfortable sitting for a year, essentially knowing that they'll slide into that spot when Ballo leaves, that's always a possibility as well. But we'll see how that develops. We'll leave it there for today. If there's more news, obviously, indystar.com/sports. We'll hop back on here if there's anything worth talking about. But just wanted to kind of check in, get kind of just I guess a lay of the land in the sort of post Umar Ballo commitment, moving into Little 500 weekend, where Indiana was expected and is still expected to have some high profile visitors on campus. Again, subscribe to the YouTube channel, please, and whether it's again indystar.com/sports, Twitter, here, whatever. Again, as things happen, obviously we will continue to react to them. But for now, for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. Thanks so much for watching. We'll talk to you soon.